through into the rest of the week, and our live streams up. I have to remind you, YouTube, Facebook, and on X, Karibu Sana to our audience on KTN. We get into a conversation this hour, a bit of a sensitive one, but we're going to do it anyway. And just before we do that and welcome our guests into the studio, Diamond Trust Bank, DTB Mortgages, telling us the good stuff.
Diamonds. Trusted. Well, let's push that trust a little bit and let's shepherd it in the direction of a mortgage, shall we? This trusted financial institution, Diamond Trust Bank, is saying we have a plan to offer you mortgages or a mortgage that would suit your needs and your pocket. So take note of the following. 1, the interest rate will be 9% for a 10-year mortgage.
Great.
For a 25-year mortgage, the interest rate will be 9.75. 1. 2, this is made possible because Diamond Trust Bank has an understanding that with the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company, and because of that, the 9% and 9.7% will not shift or move constant.
Yep.
Okay? Diamond Trust Bank is also saying this. It doesn't matter whether you are self-employed or whether someone else has employed you, whether you're in the diaspora. So let's start. You are employed. You can access up to 105%. This means even the charges and stuff that you normally pay when you get a mortgage are taken care of by this. If you're in the diaspora, they're saying 80%. And then they're saying, look, let's just add a little icing on this. There are no hidden charges. If you pay upfront and you pay ahead of schedule, there will be no penalties. Now, in case you want to verify this information and thinking this can't be true, why don't you just send an email to mortgages@dtbafrica.com, or better still, let your feet do the walking. Go to any Diamond Trust Bank branch and ask for this information. It will be given to you.
It will be given to you. Fantastic. 1 million people get into the job market every year. And from that 1 million people, not everybody has the skills that they need to be able to make the connect to work or towards business. So KCB Foundation, through the 2G Ajiri program, says, we see you. And what they've done for youth between the ages of 18 and 35 is that they've been able to connect them now to skills training for 6 months. You finish that skills training for 6 months. You then get a toolkit, and you then get access to loans, and then also placement in jobs, or then get the boost that you need for business, making sure that you can get through those different skills that you might want to: automotive engineering, masonry, plumbing, beauty and design, photography. I mean, the list is endless, and has helped up to 155,000 youth around the country so far, and is willing to do more. How do you find out information about that? Go to KCB Group/foundation. It's changing lives, one skill set at a time. We're getting into a conversation this morning that has been doing the rounds, and we've talked about how we can shed some light into what is really happening and what the call would be. I mean, it's splashed all around the headlines, but this morning we will and already welcome our guest. Martin Mavenjina is a senior program advisor, transitional justice at the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and we're talking about forced disappearances and unlawful detention, a Ugandan case study this morning. Martin, good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you again in the Situation Room. How are you doing?
Good. Always a pleasure to come to the Situation Room, to the hot seat.
To the hot seat.
Yes.
You're in the hot seat this morning, and it is a hot topic and a sensitive one for a lot of people. From the pictures that we've seen, from the things that we have heard, from the cases that are ongoing. But we'll go into those in detail. How about we welcome you first of all with today's proverb, and then you can interpret that for us and tell us what it means to you.
Okay. Sure.
All right.
Our proverbs for the whole of this week come from the Republic of Niger. Okay? You know, it is some countries have a president, some countries have...
Some presidents have a country? Okay, sorry.
Some even have a prime minister. Some even have a king. Some even have a queen.
Oh, yes.
Okay? Yes. Well, in Niger, they have a president of the National Council. So it's not just president. It's like we've got this group of people who are going to take charge, and there's a president. All right? Right. Let's look at the proverb. Only God can chase away flies from a tailless cow.
Only God can chase away.
Yes, only God can chase away flies from a tailless cow.
Okay, that's a good one. So, my interpretation of that is of the proverb Aziz is that it literally means that God is the creator of of all living creatures, because when you look at it, only God can chase away. I mean, yeah, that's my literal interpretation.
Yeah.
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 The interpretation is good. You're clearly a God-fearing person.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You're going to come with what you need,
Yes.
essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God will cover you.
Yeah.
Provider.
Even if you don't have something, He'll fill that gap for you.
Indeed. All right. Let's look at filling the gaps this morning, shall we, Martin?
Sure.
We're doing a Ugandan case study this morning, of course. We'll come down to the details of some of the things that we've seen later. But just paint with broad strokes, paint a picture for us of what is happening. When we talk about forced disappearances and unlawful detention, what is happening in Uganda? Far be it from Kenya to be able to have conversations about what's happening in Kenya, not take into consideration what's happening, in neighboring countries. Paint that picture for us to have an understanding of what is really happening in Uganda.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Du. So, the current context of what is happening in Uganda is not something new. For a very long time, people who have been critical to the government of the day have been disappeared, and this has usually happened in the context of a run-up to an election. So, if you remember, in the run-up to the 2021 election, there were very many opposition supporters who were disappeared.
Yeah.
And this is well documented by the Uganda Human Rights Commission and a host of other civil society organizations in Uganda. So for a very long time, it's a vice that has actually manifested itself for an inordinate period of time. We have close to over 500 Ugandans unaccounted for. And that is primarily because, as is right now, yes, in as much as Uganda agreed to the International Convention on Enforced Disappearance in June 1995, they have not made any practical arrangements in trying to actually come up with a legal framework of domesticating that important piece of convention. So as is, because you do not have an enabling piece of legislation that actually criminalizes the act of enforced disappearances, then it simply explains why security agents are more emboldened to actually continuously commit those who are deemed critical to the government. Now, in terms of from the different media reports and those that have been documented by civil society organizations, you do realize that there has been, allegations that most of these people are disappeared by specialized security agencies, specifically the Special Force Command, that is an entity within one of the security apparatuses, and then, of course, the Chieftaincy of Military Intelligence. So when you look at Uganda's security terrain or security structure, there are a lot of specialized security entities that are best to deal with different... the presumption is that they were created to enhance security, but in hindsight, what that has done is that it has given them unfettered discretion to commit more serious crimes.
Right.
So, fast forward, just to drive home to your question. So, what is happening right now in Uganda is we have an opposition leader who was actually unlawfully, may I say, was actually abducted and disappeared from right here in Nairobi, only to be found tried before the court martial. Today actually marks 96 days since the trial began. On the 31st of January this year, we did have the Supreme Court pronouncing itself on the whole question of whether civilians can be tried in the general court martial. And while we appreciate that Dr. Besigye was actually served in the Uganda People's Defense Forces, he did retire honorably. So as is and up to date, he's a civilian and cannot be subjected to a trial in a court martial. So that question of who gets to be tried in a court martial is something that the courts have been grappling with. And it all began when the state sued Honorable Michael Kabaziguruka, who was then a former MP. He was tried in the military court martial for treason, and he
All right.
challenged that. So fast forward, the Attorney General challenged challenged the decision that was given in Honorable Kabara's in the MP's favor, and the Supreme Court has since pronounced itself. So as we speak today, they have not been. Today actually marks 18 days since that decision that was passed. In fact, 19 days. So the authorities in Uganda have not done anything.
What was the decision that was made by the Supreme Court?
So the decision that was made by the Supreme Court was, one, the key take-home was civilians cannot be tried in the General Court Martial.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They also requested the government of the day to make to revise the provisions within the Uganda People's Defence Forces Act, because the Act as is seemed to give them leeway to actually try civilians. But in actual sense, when you look at how courts are structured in Uganda, the General Court Martial has a semblance of the High Court. I mean, it's at par with the High Court, but in hierarchies of when you look at the hierarchy of the courts, the Supreme Court is the one that makes the final decision. So, as is, you cannot actually try a civilian in the General Court Martial. The other thing that the Supreme Court directed was that Dr. Kizza Besigye should have been unconditional release,
Yes.
and his trial should have been transferred to a civilian court.
Oh.
So in this instance, that proceeding would have been decided on its merits in a high court.
So because if he did go to then a civilian court, then the issues of perhaps granting of bail and such then could come into play.
Yes.
Now, this is not the first time that we've seen Kizza Besigye arrested, held.
Yes.
This is easily a decade-long
Yes, correct.
behavior that we have seen.
Yes.
Now, I'm trying to tie that with what you said, whereby over 500 Ugandans, I mean,
The number could actually be higher.
it could
than
be
that.
higher,
Yes.
and it's a ridiculously high number.
Yes.
And if we say that there is basically a cloud cover of anyone critical of the government and the administration of Yoweri Museveni, then the likelihood of having them disappeared is significantly higher. Tie all of these things together, where at some point, I mean, just looking at international relations, I would say when Kizza Besigye took a walk in Kampala, he could be arrested.
Yes.
He opened his mouth and took a breath, he could be arrested. So are we looking at personal vendetta, or are we looking at criticism of the government is something that is frowned upon, and that is a policy whereby we're going to have a visit with you should you be critical of government?
Yeah. So I think for the longest time, what is transpiring in Uganda is a simple playbook trick that all repressive regimes have used for the longest time. Anybody who is deemed to be critical to the government of the day, or critical to, or a threat to the government of the day, or even tries to challenge the authorities that seem to be a threat. And when you look at Dr. Kizza Besigye, rightly said, yes, he's not the only one who's been targeted. I mean, Honorable Robert Chagulanyi, popularly known as Bobby Wine, has faced the same tribulations over time again, and many other people who have actually opposed the regime of the day. So it's something that has been happening for long, and unfortunately, I think the international community has let down very many Ugandans, because ideally there should be spaces in which countries should be held to account, to kept in check. For instance, when you look at the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism, that is a UN peer review mechanism, that is a framework that the Ugandan government should have been held in check. Not even going so far, the East African community should have actually reined in on Uganda for those acts, because when you look at what they signed on in the treaty, all countries say they'll aspire to ensure that citizens enjoy their fundamental rights and freedoms. But just going back to what you'd said, yes, the Ugandan Constitution actually provides for the rights of an accused person, and under Chapter 4, and it's very elaborate, whereby an accused person should be entitled to legal representation, and it's akin to what is replicated in the Kenyan Constitution. But when you look at the manner in which the trial has been started, the manner in which Dr. Besigye has been persecuted right from the onset, right from his unlawful abduction here in Nairobi, which actually is all riddled with, I must say, Andrew, that there is no way that Dr. Besigye could have arrived from and got into Kenya on the 28th of November through JKA, and then within 48 or 56 hours, you find he's in a general court-martial. I mean, there is literally no way you can get CT out of Kenya here and ends up in Kampala without some semblance of cooperation from the security agencies here. So
Kenya, essentially what we are saying is that Kenya cooperated for this to happen? Is Kenya to blame for this?
Yes, and cooperation can...
Entirely?
No, yes, cooperation can be seen, complacency can be seen based on your silence or by your conduct. Now, in the current circumstances, Kenya has a very elaborate border control system. I mean, if you come through JKIA, you can only exit through the usual border points. And the beauty about Nairobi is that most of our roads are manned with CCTV cameras. So it beats logic that a prominent figure like Dr. Kizza Besigye could actually be abducted from Westlands. And then 56 hours later, we are being informed that he's actually in the general court-martial. But be as it may, there are some statements that we've seen on media, in different media spaces that have actually alluded to Kenya being an aid and abettor to what he's going through. About a week ago, the spokesperson of the Uganda People's Defense Forces, that is Felix Kulaiji, was on record in the media house saying, well, if we wanted to actually harm Besigye, we could have done it when we actually abducted him from Nairobi. So by the time, the spokesperson of the military is telling you, or he's insinuating we could have done once if we wanted, it's an inference that they couldn't not have done this without cooperation or some form of assistance from their counterparts.
If I look at this globally, because you said essentially this is the order of the day in different governments, and I'm looking at the African continent for that matter. In fact, alluding that Kenya assisted, with what's happening to Dr. Besigye. What then happens to documents like the African Human Rights System rooted in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights? I think it's called Banjul Charter.
Yes, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights.
That aims to protect and promote human rights across the continent. We're looking at civil, political, economic, and social and cultural rights as well as people's rights. Because someone would say then they're not respected, they don't apply, then presidents or the leaders of the day get to do things based on what exactly, if not this. And also, there has been concerns, even here in Kenya, where you'd hear leaders say, well, the highest we can go is the ICC or the East African, court. Are they really, helpful in as far as these situations are concerned? Because even though the courts pronounced themselves on the position of Besigye's, trial in the military court, there is content of that same order. What do you think really these charters are for if they're not taken into consideration?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the framers of these charters, like the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and a host of several international instruments, were aimed at ensuring that we have progressive pieces of laws or legislations that actually ensure that fundamental rights and freedoms are enjoyed by citizens, not only within Africa, but also globally. And these same charters also create a semblance of a framework of accountability whereby states are kept in check. Now, what many states have done for the longest time is that they have signed onto these charters, or they have, but what they fail to do is to replicate the provisions within these charters within their domestically within their countries. So when you look at Uganda, yes, Uganda is a signatory to the African Charter.
Yes,
it did accede to the International Convention on the Protection of Persons, all persons against enforced disappearance. But what they've not done is there is no legal framework
for the implementation of it.
Yes,
absolutely.
So with an absence of legal framework, then it's as good as saying, yes, I accept this law is progressive, but I am going to do nothing. And remember, Uganda asserted to this in 1995. How many years back?
Oh, wow.
And this is the thing, isn't it? That you can, and many would say that this is by design. This is intentional.
Yes.
Because that's the thing about charters. That's the thing about treaties, that even though you do ratify them, that one of the things that you must do in country is provide the necessary framework under which now those charters or treaties can then be implemented. So it would appear as though that it is deliberate and it's designed to not have the framework, so that you can use that as an excuse to say, well, we've not set it up, isn't it?
Yes, it's actually a well-calculated ploy, not only by Uganda, but very many states. I mean, even Kenya here.
Yes.
Just to deliberately ensure that you circumvent accountability. So if there's no framework for where you can hold perpetrators of these of the crime of enforced disappearance to account, then it simply means that it is open season. And that may explain why, even when you look at the recent ongoings in Kenya, you realize that you've seen a number of Kenyans who have been disappeared, which is not even different from what is happening in Uganda. But the key question that most of us are grappling with here is who gets to hold the perpetrators, or who gets to hold the state to account, right? And the interesting thing is that when you look at when you look at Besigye's case, I must say that for a long time, the Kenya Human Rights Commission has actually worked with victims and survivors of enforced disappearance from Kampala. In fact, in 2022, we did convene the Uganda Human Rights and Accountability Conference, where we brought victims here and they were able to share their testimony. And the whole essence of that was because they could not be able to have a forum to actually express some of the violations that have been subjected to. Now, specifically with Besigye's case, when we realized that that he had been disappeared from Nairobi, we did, assemble a legal team that's been led by the Honorable Martha Karua, and we've been working behind the scenes together with the Lord Mayor Elias Lukwago, who is a good friend of mine, and we've been trying to see how do you explore the legal channels to ensure that he's accorded, a fair trial as provided for in the Constitution. Because, I mean, be as it may, even if they were to proceed in the court-martial, the least they would have done was to accord him his constitutional rights, that is fair hearing. But when you look at what is transpiring in the court, what has transpired so far in the court-martial, he's actually been denied. In fact, the Honorable Martha Karua was actually denied a practicing certificate.
Yes.
We actually had to appeal, and it actually took the president of the Law Society of Uganda to actually say that the process the basis on which was denied was actually not right, and that is how she actually got the certificate. So,
is it temporary though?
Yes, it's temporary, because actually what happens is so you can actually apply. First and foremost, I must say that an accused person has a right to legal representation, and you have a right to choose a lawyer of your own. So it was Dr. Besigye's preference that his legal team be led by the Honorable Martha Karua. Yes.
There's something that I have to ask.
Yes.
I'm looking at our continent.
Yes.
And I'm looking at how it is the leadership, the president, the executive in this continent seem to understand that the opposition are essentially enemies. And that every attempt must be made to either minimal effort intimidate them. That is actually when they're being polite. If they have an opportunity to actually exterminate them, if they have the opportunity. But then with all these international laws encumbering them, they then decide that perhaps the best thing to do is disappear a few of their kind people who are of like-mindedness, intimidate them some more, every once in a while kill a few. Now, are we saying that we as a continent are incapable of actually adhering to certain fundamentals of human rights? Because if you look at the way we treat people who enact coups, coups send shivers down the spine of leaders of this continent. You are removed from any economic organization that you are part of. All manner of things. AU doesn't allow you to do God knows what. There's all that. So it tells you the leadership have a way of coalescing around each other. And it looks like they also have a way of coalescing around each other. Even when wrong is being committed, you do not hear our political African leaders calling each other out Or do they call each other out and I'm the one who missed that name?
And if they do,
You
do they
want in the
genuinely
party, you
call
want
each
in the
other
room.
out?
I think they do it in a more like pampered way. But just to respond to your CT, I think it is possible. Actually, it is very actually possible for all countries in Africa, including Uganda, to adhere to, the rule of law. But the biggest problem that is ailing Uganda, which is actually a common denominator that is shared by, its neighbors here, like Kenya and all the other states around Africa, is the lack of political will. There is just absolutely no political will to follow the rule of law, because when you look at what is, and what that has done to City is we've actually transnationalized enforced disappearances, because when you look at the recent ongoings, for instance, Kenya has actually become the playfield for enforced disappearances. And if you allow me, and if you look at some of the report, the incidences that have been documented in the last 5 years, is actually a very good report by Human Rights Watch. In 2017, there were 2 South Sudanese nationals who were actually abducted here in Nairobi, just in front of Kencom, and only later on to be found dead in South Sudan. So the different, and more recently, you remember, I think a couple of months ago, you remember 4 Turkish nationals were refouled from here.
Yes.
And we had our own good PS Koreo Singoe confirming that we actually refouled these fellows. So states actually try, it's when you look at the way they operate, it's more or less of a game of, self-preservation of existing status quo and what is in it for them, as opposed to following, fundamental rights and freedoms and following what is just and right. So when you look at what Dr. Kizza Besigye and, other victims of enforced disappearances are being subjected to, procedurally, you can clearly tell that they have due process wasn't followed. Yes, because if you even look at the charges that were preferred against Besigye, you'd ask yourself, so you're saying, he walked through JKIA and actually came with a firearm, and then you ask yourself, if you wanted to, to overthrow the government of Uganda, why would you
do it in Kenya?
It's not something that you can do. You can do. It's not a one. Or it's not something you can do. But bears in mind, CT. Back to your question on you did mention the aspect of countries are always afraid of unconstitutional takeovers.
Yeah.
But the sad reality is that very many countries have actually most of the crop of leaders that we have actually come through unconstitutional orders. In fact, President Museveni actually overthrew the government of the day back then, and
I think
took the arms.
you've gotten to the heart of the matter.
Yes, he's got and he took over. And what most of these leaders do is you take over government, then you try to, can I say, legitimize your stay.
Yeah.
So, because when you look at Uganda's history, yes, the government of the day was overthrown in 1986. Fast forward in 1995, we came up with a constitution that was amended again in 2005 and has seen a series of amendments. So, and that is like a steady pattern that is in very many, in some African countries. So, in as much as we now have frameworks of good governance, you can't run away from the aspect of there being an unconstitutional takeover, and that usually arises as a result of citizens or basically citizens being fed up with what the government of the day it is doing. A good case in point is when you look at the series of unconstitutional unconstitutional or unlawful change of power in West Africa. That has happened because the despots or the leaders of those days had oppressed their citizens, had violated people.
To the point that they couldn't
Yes,
take it
and they were
anymore.
like, you know what, we're fed up. And that is why, strangely, when there are unconstitutional takeovers, you see citizens are actually happy to welcome the army to actually, get rid of
And take
X
over.
or Y, because, they are outrightly oppressed. So I don't foresee an Africa whereby you will be able to prevent unconstitutional.
Do you know what is strange?
Yes.
Of all, how many countries do we have on this continent? 54?
54.
Yes.
Of all the countries we have on this continent, only 3 countries have a constitution that explicitly outlines and protects the sovereignty of the citizen. 3. Angola, Kenya, South Africa. Only. The others, more or less, Uganda features, they skirt around it. Many of they skirt around it. But to state it categorically and to explicitly express it in the Constitution so that the citizen is a sovereign. 3.
That's the conversation that we're having this morning. Martin Mavenjina is here with us as a senior program advisor, transitional justice at the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, and we're having this conversation this hour, asking ourselves, okay, and I think now we can get into the broader question, and we look at the continent of Africa and constitutionalism, which constitutions essentially should house the provisions and the protections of human rights for its citizens, regardless of who you are. Dr. Kizza Besigye sat in that chair a few months ago and basically said, you know what, rule of law must prevail. Constitutionalism must be the supremo. And so we're coming to some of those conversations when we come back right after this break. Businesses, whether they're small, whether they're medium, whether they're large, are getting onto the Vetto platform, and you ask why. Well, this is the place whereby you can make payments seamlessly. Transactions can happen for you as a small, as a medium, and as a large business in a very short period of time. And it can also happen with no hidden charges. It can also happen with affordable rates, and you can make country-to-country payments to 190 countries in 49 different currencies. VettoFX.com is the email address, or rather the site address where you can go and find out more information about how you can get your business onboarded and get into seamless, easy transactions, and you don't have to worry about the headaches of traditional payments. Do it with VettoFX.com today.
Discover something new every day on your StarTimes decoder. Buy an aerial decoder plus 1 month free classic bouquet subscription to enjoy the magic of African stories on ST Swahili, AMC Movies, and ST Nollywood. Tales of adventure that take you far on Bliss TV, ST Kung Fu, Z Cinema, and Nat Geo. Or a dish decoder plus 1 month free super bouquet subscription to watch heartwarming dramas that bring you closer.
Do you want to be my wife?
Yes, David. I want to marry you.
Exciting kids shows to keep the little ones entertained.
You got it, dude.
Experience the thrill of live sports on La Liga and Bundesliga. For every mood, for every moment. StarTimes. Enjoy digital life.
So what did you like most about this beautiful layout?
It's a 4-bedroom.
Okay.
And all the spaces are very functional.
All right.
But I'll tell you what I liked about this house. Every single space in this home, you can access the natural light. You see, the same way they tell you, don't buy a big bed. You'll be divorced. Because you'll be sleeping half and half. The room also, don't take like a big room, because actually you can live 2 separate lives.
This sunken living room is everything.
I know. And this is why I want 4 children before I'm 40. One of the things about having a sunken space, especially a living space, is it sort of takes you away from all the activities.
Yes.
But you're still within.
Learners or children born with special needs were looked upon as outcasts in the society. Things have changed. These learners or these children have been incorporated in our schools, and they are learning like any other child because there's something they can do.
We all know why we're all here. The mission is to attack. The wait is over. The real deal is here. Creatives, TikTokers, Wahesh, skillpreneurs, Masturi, Vaibu, Wacha Iwake. Target 1, DJ Matt, the Beat Assassin. Target 2, Jitabi, the Style Enforcer. Target 3, DJ Magic E, the Frequency Bandit. Target 4, Lingapenda, the Laughing Menace. Iwake, starting this Saturday, 10 p.m.
DJ Magic E, enjoy the music.
Mavinjina, who's a senior program advisor at Transitional Justice at the Kenya National Human Rights Commission. We talk about constitutions around the continent, don't we? And again, this is essentially the house for a lot of things. One of them being human rights and how they should be protected, how they should be adhered to by the government of the day. I think there are too many examples of how these rights have been abrogated over and over and over again. And that the constitutions of nations seem to be suggestions, even though they're the supreme law, they seem to be suggestions. And it's very clear what somebody should be or should not be allowed to do under that law. Now, if we zero in on what's happening right now in Uganda, it's interesting because I saw a comment that it would be probably very difficult to have this same conversation that we are having in Uganda at the moment. Why are we able to have situations like this in the glare of day without anything significantly being done to counter a negative situation?
Thanks for that question, Du. I think first and foremost, we must acknowledge that very many countries, including Uganda, have got a very progressive constitution. In fact, when you look at how the framers crafted the Ugandan constitution in 1995, it was very consultative. They had different representation from all quarters of the country, and the constitution as was in 1995 was what very many Ugandans wanted. But of course, along the way, which is actually similar to other jurisdictions, or or at least what we've seen in other jurisdictions, is I think what makes what actually aids and abates the undermining of progressive constitutions is primarily one. Either you have a leader who has been in power for long, and because he has to stay in power for an indeterminate period of time, then there are certain provisions that may have to be amended, like is the case with the Ugandan constitution. And then two, you could have ideally, when you look at many constitutions, there is this aspect of separation of powers. So the presumption is that the judiciary should actually act independently. But when you look at the constitution, the composition and constitution of Uganda's judiciary, I mean, at one point in time, we had a former state minister of defense being the deputy chief justice, right? So ideally, in any progressive, and that was ideally in any progressive, or put simply, you can't have one Mheshimiwa Murkomen tomorrow being the deputy chief justice or the chief justice, because there is information that you may stumble on serving on this other side of government that may impede your ability to independently exercise your judicial authority. So back to your question, Du. So what has happened in the case of Uganda is you find that, I mean, some of the judges have been allegedly called, pro-regime judges. So that may explain why sometimes the cases, critical constitutional questions take a long time, or why the state has actually been able to amend certain provisions. And that is actually not so far from other jurisdictions, because what is actually happening there is not new.
No.
So what that means is that because states can actually have engineered a way in which to circumvent constitutional provisions, then you undermine, the key provisions of the constitution, and such violations would actually continue to subsist. I mean, you do remember some time, I think last year, or even I think they were in there after the 2022 election. No, actually, I think last year.
Yeah.
You remember there was talk in Kenya of wanting to try to amend the Kenyan constitution. But by extension, the thing we have to, you have to appreciate is that, you see, you learn bad habits from your neighbors, right? So when you have bad neighbors, the chance, if CT was my neighbor and he's a very bad neighbor and he's doing all these bad things, there's a high possibility that I might pick a leaf, and maybe that is why you're seeing some of the bad habits being replicated.
The sitting next to you is not really
Something's going to rub off somewhere.
And that just reminds me, if I may just ask, because as any other curious listener, I want to just bring out the case in point of the 36. Were there 36 about members of the Ugandan opposition? I think that is the Forum for Democratic Change, FDC. Now, this particular people were in Kenya. Again,
in Kisumu.
In Kisumu, right? They had traveled to Kenya, City, Kisumu for a training course, according to their lawyers then, but were deported back to neighboring Uganda, where authorities charged them with terrorism-related, offenses. I am curious to understand how are this? How did that case go? Was it truly a terrorism, kind of training? And to, again, bring Kenya into that conversation. And also, what are the charges that Besigye is facing for some of the listeners who are still getting in tune with what exactly is his offense? Because day in, day out, it's always quite repetitive that he is in for something. Which one has he committed this time?
So let me just start. Let me start by answering your question in reference to the 36 Ugandans who had actually come to the training were actually the charges actually preferred against them were actually quite baffling, because considering that those 36 Ugandans actually traveled by road and were cleared through the border points and got into Kenya and were received by their Kenyan counterparts through the border port. So now to turn around and actually what happened was that they were abducted from Kisumu, taken back to Kampala, and actually tried. So I mean, it beats logic, because you're like, so these fellows actually passed here. So if they actually had an offense, if they had committed some serious crimes, then it would have been hard for them actually to leave.
In fact, they were arguing that they drew the Kenyan security forces' attention as they were suspected to be engaging in some covert activities that were subversive.
And that also and that just drives that whole aspect of, you can be an aid and abettor to a violation based on the way the way you conduct yourself, and that's just another example of how Kenya cannot absolve itself from this whole conversation of actually, playing a critical role in having Dr. Besigye taken back to be tried in the court-martial. So that is just another example of how the authorities here must have facilitated their counterparts to take back those Ugandans to be tried. But back to you, and that case is still ongoing.
Okay.
Of course, it would be, ideally, it should be decided on its merits, and I don't think those Ugandans will be tried of any specific, culpable of commission of any offense, because ideally, when somebody is tried in a court of law for an offense, you must prove the ingredients of that offense. So when you come to Dr. Besigye's case, I don't think even the lawyers for the general court martial will be able to get the ingredients of the offense.
To get something to stick.
Yes, because the offense you're trying to accuse him of, you're alleging it was not even committed within jurisdiction. But so what they're trying to do is, of course, there's been talk that they want to try him for treason or this or that. But you see, even in as much as the Ugandan Penal Code provides for treason, and in as much as the UPDF Act provides for the crimes that you can try an individual for, the quick question here we have to ask ourselves is Dr. Kizza Besigye an active military officer? He is not. Now, if he's not an active military officer, it simply means that you cannot try him in the general court martial. That matter has been settled and sealed by the Supreme Court as of 31st of this year. So as is, and actually we did support the legal team to actually submit, led by Honorable Kenya Human Rights Commission supported the legal team led by Honorable Martha Karua to submit an application for writ of habeas corpus, because actually what should have happened is when the Supreme Court decision was arrived at, then Dr. Besigye should have, and by extension, all other civilians being tried by military courts should have been transferred to civilian courts. That did not happen.
Yeah.
So that explains why we opted to go for the writ of habeas corpus. So writ of habeas corpus is produce somebody dead or alive, before the court of law.
Okay.
And that explains why. So ideally, ideally, as we speak today, Dr. Besigye should be presented before a civilian court. And if there are any merits of the case against him by the state, then they should be argued out and let the court decide based on what is being presented. But on the face of it, and based on the procedure on how the matter arrived in court, it's riddled with illegalities.
I want to look at statements that were made by the president of Uganda just a couple of days ago, and actually yesterday. This is done on social media, and as well as Muhoozi Kainerugaba, his son, did make a statement yesterday. I think it was interesting. It may not. When we try to dissect it, it doesn't sound very pretty, because your desire is to be on the right side. But what could be the reason? Beyond just what we have said, brute force, where you want things to go your way and you don't want any criticism of the administration. What would be the reason where we have accusations of abrogation of human rights flying all over the place, but still you hold fast to a position which talks about attempted treasonous acts? Would one be so foolish, for want of a better word, to hold on to a particular position in broad daylight for 96 days, if there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that had been suggested, done, or planned?
Thanks for that question, Du. I think, first and foremost, yes, you're right. The president of Uganda actually did share on his X handle. He did express his dissatisfaction with the judgment that was issued by the Supreme Court on the 31st of January. And the same sentiments were shared by the Chief of Defense Forces, who happens to be his son, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba. But you see, the thing is, though, you want to believe that actually the reality is that Uganda is a law-abiding country that is governed by the Constitution. And that same Constitution is the one that bestows power on the person of the president, and by extension creates, the other arms of government, including the judiciary, and by extension the Supreme Court. And that very same Constitution says that you have to obey the decision of the Supreme Court. So it can't be that ideally, if you are not satisfied with the decision of the Supreme Court, the unfortunate reality is that is the final court of that is
the court of last resort.
Yes, the court of yes, that's the apex or the last court. So beyond that, you can't go further. And I mean, if you flip it the other way around, and City, and I mean, Dr. Besigye has challenged presidential elections before, and it was not on his favor. And well, he did not say. I mean, he accepted the decision of the court. So ideally, what we would expect is that the president, and by extension, those in the establishment would actually would have to actually accept the decision of the court. So unless otherwise, the other only recourse is you can actually entertain this matter in a civilian court and let the case be heard on its merits, if any. But as is, I mean, you could say that we will not obey the Supreme Court, blah blah blah. But well, there's only that much you can say, because the practical reality is in as much and which is what they've done by extension is, yes, they have actually are still holding him. They're actually still holding him against his will. And when you look at what is happening is, from the Supreme Court ruling, there are key things that the government has not addressed. And there's just a series of questions when you look at the Supreme Court judgment. The first is, I mean, under what framework is Dr. Besigye being continually held? Yeah? Because I mean, the answer is simple. There's no framework, and his continued holding is
under threat.
No. City, when you look at the Constitution of Uganda, yes, it does provide for national security,
Yes.
but then that provision does not circumvent the provisions enshrined under the Bill of Rights of the 1995 Constitution.
I'm going somewhere with this.
Yes.
You see, it's a question, this is a round-robin question that we'll ask ourselves as Africans. But the rule of law will be aspirational for as long as the citizens don't understand their sovereignty and what it means. Because the real check to power is not parliamentarians or the opposition party. No. It is the citizenry.
Yes.
When the elected leaders know that they'll be held to account, they behave. When they know they don't have to be held to account or they will be supported by the same citizenry, when they do what they like, then what we see is an upsurge and a growth and an institutionalization of impunity. That's what we see.
Yes.
So all that seems to be happening on this continent in one way or the other, despite our shouting loudly that we are democracies, is monarchies have started creeping in slowly, gently, but most assuredly. Because if you look at the behaviors of monarchies and how it is that they existed, there was an absolutism about it.
Yes.
In fact, they gave themselves qualities that you'd give a deity. Okay? And once an individual who is human like you becomes a deity, then just the very concept of freedom and democracy goes out of the window completely, because they are everything. They are the rule of law. They are the final word. It is them. Now, the check and balance comes about when people, you see, the very leaders we're talking about understood this. That is why they led the insurrections that they led.
Yes.
Because they figured this thing is not working. Okay? And so they brought into being the very thing that they wanted. And now the strange thing, they're becoming the very thing they did not want.
They didn't want.
Yes.
Or what they fought against previously.
Yes. I think, just to respond, I think power is like, or authority is like a poison chalice. You know, the longer you stay, you know, the more it poisons you. And if you look around Africa, I mean, most of the presidents who have stayed on for long, who have held a firm grip of power, have outrightly been autocratic and repressive. I mean, look at President Paul Biya. I mean, or look at just look around the world. I mean, around the continent. You know, all these leaders who have been there for a long time. I mean, it's strange that that, you know, a leader's been there for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years, and then citizens are more than happy to let him or her, you know. So, like I said, power is like a poison chalice. The longer you have a leader, then the more, you know, the systems that are put in place become weakened. Ideally, in any progressive democracy, we do have the doctrine of separation of powers that should be able to check the three arms of government. The judiciary should play an instrumental role in trying to interpret repressive decisions, policy provisions by either the legislators or the executive. And that is what has happened in Uganda.
For the people who listen, who watch every day and say, should these rights be held, or how should these rights be held? What would be your message to them really quickly?
I think my message to them is to the people, especially to Ugandans and also to other Africans or even Kenyans, is that they should be optimistic, because I mean, first and foremost, I must say, nothing lasts forever. We have seen repressive regimes that have come to pass, and we must be optimistic. We must follow the rule of law. And it is my hope and prayer that that Kizza Besigye will enjoy the rights that is guaranteed under the Constitution, and that he will be vindicated of any accusations that is being subjected to. Yes.
Martin Mavenjina is a senior program advisor, transitional justice at the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, and has been our guest this hour, looking into some of these issues that do plague nations. Thank you for being here this morning and sharing those insights with us, and let's see how things progress over the coming weeks. Asante sana.
Okay. Thank you, Thank you, City. Thank you.
Doris. Good morning, everybody.
Yes.
It's 8 a.m.
Yeah.